Hello and welcome to Blogging Heads. My name is Zack Beauchamp. I am a reporter blogger at Think Progress. And today I'm going to be talking with
Michael Brendan Dougherty. I am currently national correspondent at the American Conservative. We're here to chat about some ongoing disagreements that you and I have.
Right.
Hopefully productively.
We'll try. We'll try to make a no yelling rule.
Yeah, of course.
Considering I got yelled at last night for no reason. Long story, unrelated, but it wasn't my fault, I promise.
All right, so where should we begin? Right? Foreign policy, I think?
Sure, let's start with that. So, obviously right now, and especially given some recent articles that have been written, there's a long-running debate about intervention in the Syria conflict. I find myself, I've written in the past that I've been opposed to it. I find myself increasingly sympathetic to the arguments in favor of intervention, but still not convinced, even though I have a sort of principled commitment to the idea that it's justifiable and sometimes morally mandatory to intervene in humanitarian crises, particularly in the case of genocide. But I think your analysis of the situation, Michael, and sort of the principles involved more broadly is quite different.
Yeah, so I'm really a lot more skeptical of the case to intervene, and specifically I'm very skeptical of I guess you'd call it the emerging norm of responsibility to protect, which is what it's kind of a way of trying to establish an international norm for when a government loses their sovereignty or when other governments have a duty or sort of moral license to act and intervene. It's something that's been talked about it was talked about a lot with our intervention in Libya, and it's being talked about again in Syria. And I think this is a norm with serious problems. Mostly in that if it were widely accepted, and I think it is gaining some acceptance, I think there's a very simple moral hazard argument that I take from an academic named Alan Cooperman at University of Texas in Austin. And he basically says there's a simple moral hazard problem, which is that once Western nations accept that they have a responsibility to protect minorities or political groups that are under siege in their own country, it effectively lowers the price for rebellion in any country, because a rebel group could decide, well, we may not be able to topple a regime on our own and establish law and justice for ourselves, or separation or secession, but if we can provoke a humanitarian crisis, then the Western powers will come in and do the work we can't do for ourselves. So that's sort of the quickest way of phrasing my objection to it. I think I think it's a very fine. I think it has some of the same risks that sort of the announcement of the doctrine of self-determination after World War I posed, of just lowering and encouraging breakup and rebellion, and also the violence that comes with it.
Okay, a lot that I disagree with there. Let's start. I have multiple different problems with the Cooperman thesis. Let's start with the first argument, which is its claim about the causes of rebellion and civil war. So, in order for that argument to work, it would have to be clearly demonstrated that outside intervention serves as an incentive that can essentially push a conflict or a rebel group that wouldn't otherwise take up arms to take up arms and try to overthrow a government that they wouldn't otherwise, right? So otherwise it's not serving as a moral hazard. And my read of the research on the causes of civil wars and civil conflict suggests that it's much more about particular domestic crises, conflicts over resources, mostly, as far as I understand it, conflicts over resources, political grievances, etc., that are specifically domestic to that case, and that those are the make or break things, and that there are other background conditions that are relevant, but that rebel groups are much more likely to start. Rebellions don't just start as sort of planned enterprises where there's an end game already at the beginning. Syria is a great example here, right? In that
That's right.
It started as a protest movement. So Cooperman's argument assumes a degree of rationality, like, okay, we get from point A to point B, but the West coming and helping us. Whereas it seems like these are much more organic, locally driven processes by a set of disparate actors rather than things that make unified decisions in the way that the model assumes.
Right. I think you're right that it's not that Cooperman's paper on this sort of presents it as a very sort of almost like a math equation, and most political events are not so easy. But I mean, I do think he makes a case that when you look at a situation like you had in Darfur in Sudan, where the possibility of Western intervention was clearly in the mind of some of the actors and could have contributed to violence. And the other thing that, Southern rebels engage in a series of attacks. There's violent response from the northern government, and the UN debates, about the merit of intervening or giving some kind of aid. They give aid like food aid, aid short of arms and troops, and does that then encourage the rebel group to keep going? And often the rebel groups are not the ones suffering the most from the violence. I mean, they are actors in the violence, but the people they claim to represent are the ones who then are exposed to genocidal violence.
But Darfur is a bad example to make that argument from, because Darfur was a pretty unequivocal case of extermination by the central government against an ethnic minority. And while there have been tensions between the two conflicts in both cases, right? The call to intervene in Darfur didn't come when a rebel group started attacks and it was just a civil war. This is another one of the problems that's specific to R2P. That R2P isn't about any old civil war. It's about serious cases of gross human rights violations. There's strong threshold and principled arguments built into the R2P norm. And so Darfur, the reason that it became such a touchstone for the anti-genocide movement and sort of spawned the modern anti-genocide movement as we know it in a certain sense, is because it was so unequivocally extermination, right, and ethno-religious extermination particularly. So I don't think there was any moral hazard going on there that was encouraging the calls to intervention. I think it was the behavior of the central government, and that would have happened irrespective of whether or not there was a track record of intervention, because even at that point, the R2P norm was barely in its infancy and not really a huge part of the Darfur conversation.
Right. No, I agree that the norm, I mean, it's something that's been emerging out of basically several post-Cold War conflicts, but it's only really taken full fruit in the past decade. But I'm not sure where to go from here, but it's what then is you talk about there are these established thresholds for determining whether these are human rights abuses or not. I mean, can you describe that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So R2P, it was created as the outgrowth of a 2001 document that was written by the International Commission something on sovereignty. I don't remember exactly what ICISS stands for, on state sovereignty, I think. And the ICISS report has sort of served as the intellectual basis or foundation for the way that the norm is getting debated and implemented and discussed today. And the standards in that report are very clearly tied to traditional just war theory, which was presented not as sort of an invitation on how to start wars, but rather a constraint on when states can justifiably begin wars that tried to narrow the scope of justified and acceptable wars to a very small set of circumstances. And more modern just war theory since, probably the 1960s, has recognized a right to intervene only in exceptional cases. And it includes things like last resort, that is, that no other means of resolving the conflict could possibly work at this point. Or the other one is reasonable prospects for success. There's 4 of them, actually. Reasonable prospects for success is another good one, because it shows that you can't intervene in a conflict if you're going to make the problem you're trying to solve worse. And that's actually been my objection to the proposed Syria intervention plans, is they've all failed the reasonable prospect standard. And so my point is that, and in fact I made that case on R2P grounds very explicitly, because R2P should be used both as a reason to intervene in cases where it's justified and a reason why not in other ones. And the document, I think, is very clear on this point, that it's, if anything, an improvement on the ad hoc process, which didn't set up anything like these standards that we had been using, especially in the 90s, which is a particularly egregious time for humanitarian intervention in circumstances.
But are there not, there are other little things in the critique of R2P that I'd be interested in hearing you address. I mean, Cooperman and others have brought up that in many cases, the ability to intervene, I mean, the West uses heavy material, it takes time to move troops, your intention is obviously signaled, and that this can have the effect of kind of accelerating the violence. So, for instance, in Serbia, you find Milosevic going on a kind of killing spree to kind of make sure that, to try to ensure that there was nothing left to intervene on behalf of, and that the very process of impending intervention exacerbated the violence and made it worse before we got there.
My concern with that argument is that it assumes that mass murder isn't already going on, which in a case of humanitarian intervention it probably is. So it's possible, and in fact we know, at least from in one case, at the end of the Holocaust, that Nazi troops, in anticipation of particularly Soviet advances, but Allied advances as well, would en masse kill Jewish prisoners and put them on death marches to try to complete their awful work as quickly as they could. Right, so that's an example of that happening, but the point there is that these sides are often engaged in processes of mass extermination anyway, and it's not that hurrying it up is that causing them to do it in a shorter time frame is going to make any difference in terms of casualties. I really hate discussing it this abstractly, because these are mass killings we're talking about, and if they're going to take place no matter what, the point is to prevent them from escalating and getting worse. That is, the fact that things happen at a more rapid pace doesn't mean that more atrocities will happen. It just means that the time frame is shifted. The question is whether an intervention will mean more or less atrocities.
Well, I think you're begging the question, though. I mean, because at some level, so in some conflicts, there is not going to be, with absent intervention, there's not going to be necessarily like a final solution imposed, as say the Germans are trying to implement with captive Jews. But instead, you can have long-running conflict that exhausts itself. But when we're talking about Western intervention, we are talking about, in a conflict, ending it decisively, often through destroying the regime that we've deemed to be violating human rights or in the process of committing genocide. So it does make, if the stakes are not, the stakes are raised to the level of existential for the regime that we've deemed to be in violation. Whereas before they may not be. It may be their stakes are control of a certain city or a region, not their very existence. And regimes that are under threat of not existing anymore do act differently than ones that are simply engaged in, a local atrocity or a pecuniary motive of trying to get a resource-rich region under their control. So I'm not sure that, absent intervention, the same level of violence would necessarily happen, just under a different set of circumstances.
Well, we have to be careful. We have to be careful about assuming that all interventions are the same, and further that we need that an argument for humanitarian military intervention in principle is an argument for in any case that one might potentially raise the idea, right? So, there are lots of people on the neoconservative right who talk about intervening all the time in cases that I don't think would be particularly well served by intervention, right? So I'm not defending a position that any time there's something bad going on that we need to get involved in it. But I want to go back to the first point too, which is that there are multiple kinds of intervention, right? So when we talk about the missed chances, particularly in intervention, things like getting into World War II faster, whether or not that would have been militarily viable is a separate question, or Rwanda in 1994, or Darfur in the mid 2000s. These were all clear cases where there was an exterminatory potential. Or, I mean, it happened. We know for a fact that there was mass extermination happening of a particular population. Or the other case that's sort of a clear, we need to deal with the regime that's perpetrating these type things was, I think anyway, and we can debate this if we want, Libya last year, where Gaddafi, it looked like all the signs indicated there was an impending massacre coming. We couldn't be 100% sure, but I think the preponderance of the evidence suggested that was the case. And so then you need to stop that from happening and then prevent the government's capability from doing it again. But in other cases of sort of continual civil war, the sort of intervention that might be more justified is, say, a United Nations peacekeeping operation under Chapter 7. That's still an armed military intervention authorized to use force, but it's one that's supposed to simply put a barrier between the two fighting forces, as opposed to end the regime. That is to say, not all military interventions are reducible to regime change, and indeed, we have a strong wealth of evidence that UNPKOs have been relatively successful in tamping down conflicts. So I would say that R2P can be used in multiple fashions, and a regime change must stop the mass atrocities as opposed to must end the fighting is only one subset of the sorts of interventions I think can be justified.
Okay, I mean, that's fair, but in practice, so in Libya, for instance, I mean, we did end up tipping, the idea was sort of separating the forces, right? As it was originally pitched in the opening weeks when we were debating, not that there was much debate, really, the Obama administration acted very quickly without a lot of consult or public debate in the United States. And it acted quickly under this idea that there was an emergency and impending massacre. Now, subsequently, that action did lead to regime change. I mean, it wasn't like telling two kids to go to their side of the room and stay well behaved.
Yeah.
Right. And further, I mean, the other reason I'm hesitant to get involved in these kinds of conflicts, like in Libya, is that because we intervened, even if we're not necessarily the decisive factor, although I think a strong argument can be made that in Libya we were, that Western intervention was, we become morally responsible and politically responsible for anything that sort of happens in the future. All the dominoes that fall afterward become ours, in the sense of there can be blowback. If the new regime or government fails, we can be held responsible by parties that lose. I was very worried about, at the time, the intervention in Libya, about the fate of sub-Saharan immigrants to Libya under the new regime, with good reason. So, you have this norm of responsibility to protect, but then, and you outline several things. So, and I agree that they do reflect just war theory in the sense of, evaluating your chance for success. But the one part that's interesting, and it seems like a separation from, say, Augustinian just war theory, is that Augustinian just war theory talks about wars that involved the party itself. The United States was not attacked by Gaddafi in this latest skirmish. It was human rights, and that, I guess, is maybe my deeper problem, is that it makes this concept of human rights sort of a universal property that when it's assaulted in a certain way, it obligates us to become involved. And I think afterward, you have the tumbling dominoes of effects that we can't predict. I mean, no one was talking about the spillover in Mali, not even people who were against the intervention in Libya. So, I mean, I guess that's, I don't know if I want you to respond to that. It's just another reason why I'm having trouble embracing this norm of responsibility to protect.
Yeah, I guess there's two separate arguments in there. I think, right? There's the blowback type arguments and the unintended consequences stuff, which is obvious. It's obviously a serious concern, right? You can't say that that's not a problem, right? You just have to, and because since they're unintended, it's inevitable that you can't factor them into whatever calculations you're going to make about intervention. But of course, the same can be said about the status quo, right? So our inability to predict the future applies just as well to current trends as it does to ones that might be changed by a Western military intervention in one of these conflicts because they're so complex. And so it's very hard to say that there wouldn't be unintended consequences to not intervening in a case like Libya. And moreover, it's not clear that what does end up happening afterwards is directly causally related to what we did do. So Mali is a good example.
Not necessarily, but I mean, in reality, if for whatever reason you're on the wrong side of the Libya conflict because of your tribal affiliation, whatever happens afterward, you are going to be thinking of the French and American fighter jets and hold them at least partially responsible for your dispossession, the murder of your cousin, whatever it is, your grievances after, regime change. Correct?
Well,
I mean,
you might think that, but there's no evidence of anti-American terror groups or otherwise sympathy to anti-American causes arising in Libya after the intervention on the part of parties that have been, even parties that have been wronged, like sub-Saharan Africans, who, again, it would be dishonest of me not to admit that there were serious harmful consequences for those communities, that people were killed and tortured who shouldn't have been, and that was almost certainly a consequence of the intervention. I mean, you have to own that there will be bad things happening, but that's true on both sides, right? That no matter what you choose to do, a significant number of people are going to be hurt in unconscionable ways, and the question is, how do you make your decision in such a terrible circumstance?
But I also question, and I guess this is where I would even go beyond Cooperman, I question the sense of ownership over the conflict, right? So the decision not to intervene, as you bring up, has consequences as well, right? So say we don't intervene in Libya, we don't intervene in Syria, rebel groups and the people they represent are absolutely annihilated, genocide occurs. Responsibility to protect essentially says that the United States or European powers had responsibility in the case of in cases where they didn't intervene. So in the sense that responsibility to protect, it's interesting in the way that you admit you have to take ownership of the consequences of intervening. So for sub-Saharan Africans and their fate in Libya after the intervention. But responsibility to protect also places responsibility on you for when you don't intervene, so that we're morally held culpable in cases where a regime commits massive human rights abuses or genocide and we didn't intervene.
Well, assuming we could have done something about it. That's a qualifier, right? Assuming that we could have productively done something about it, then we can be held responsible. This is a odd can situation. Sorry, go on. That's just an important qualifier.
It is, although what does it actually qualify? I mean, in a sense, why wouldn't it become obligatory, if you took this doctrine seriously, to dedicate more of your domestic political resources, your money, your treasure and your blood, towards stopping evil things from happening in the world? Why not increase your odds of success by having a larger military, more expansive ability to intervene? I mean...
Right. Okay, so I think that to answer that question properly, you need to take a step back and see that R2P isn't just a freestanding moral doctrine. It's connected to ideas of the universality of human rights, or various different similar principles, right? The idea that all persons are owed certain things, regardless of nationality, and further, that we all have collective shared responsibilities to ensure, and this isn't just true in a military atrocity context, it's equally true of global poverty. That is, that if we are aiding and abetting global poverty, and the fact that people are dying of easily preventable diseases, that we have a moral obligation to do something about that. And that's because no one and no person deserves to fail to have access to basic needs and rights and, basic medical treatments and so on, and food, right? That these are things that people are owed, and things that we, as other human beings, and human beings that act politically in sort of a shared world, owe to each other. And if that's true, then the question is about effective resource prioritization. And sometimes that means military intervention, I think, and I think in a lot of cases it doesn't. In other words, you devote the amount of resources to your military and to military solutions to problems, that military solutions actually can be effective. In some cases, it's just, unfortunately and sadly, in the R2P document, again, the ICISS report, says this explicitly, that some groups of people can't be saved through military force, and that in other times it's better to devote resources to various different forms of foreign assistance, or say even dealing with climate change related problems, given massive devastation that might cause, right? So you can't just take R2P out of a box and say it says military solutions are the most important thing that we have to do. We have to balance and trade resources in the way that we always would. It's just extending the scope of moral concern, which we've really already done, to people outside of our own borders.
Being, I guess, a traditional conservative, there's almost in every clause of what you just articulated, I want to object at one point. Who owes these people? At what cost are people owed these rights and these resources? I agree that people do terrible things, right? So if I take this to a lower level of moral concern, right? So, for instance, for me, I'm constantly thinking about jurisdiction and sovereignty, right?
Right.
So, for me, an analogy on a lower level would be I think spousal abuse is wicked and a crime, and no woman should have to suffer under an abusive husband. However, if I had a friend in California who said that, they thought someone in their neighborhood was committing abuse against their wife, I would not fly out at my own expense, kick open the door, and try to set things right. Perhaps I could make a difference, but it wouldn't be in my authority to do so. And it wouldn't be wise for me to do so. And that's how I often feel about this idea of universalizing these moral obligations to each other. That I don't know. I don't know how to make sense of them. I don't know how to weigh them against each other. I find that is actually the most difficult thing. So we can prevent genocide in one place. And I also fear that the doctrines themselves, of course, will come under, would be discredited by the fact that in most cases, when you look back in history, there are other material reasons why a group of nations might militarily intervene or might have some other intervention, totally unconnected from whatever human rights lawyers are saying in the UN or at The Hague or anywhere. So I don't know. I just have lots of difficulty embracing this. I mean,
I want to get to your first point, the point about the analogy to spousal abuse, because I think it raises the moral issues in some pretty interesting ways. The reason that you wouldn't, it would seem, and again, this is sort of an intuition about that case that your description evokes, right? It would seem improper in part because we have duly constituted domestic authorities and have created a whole political superstructure and legal and policing superstructure that's supposed to deal with these sorts of cases. And that vigilante action is generally seen as destructive to a very well-ensconced constitutional political order that we accept as democratic citizens, right? And so we essentially use that as our mechanism for resolving claims of rights that are universal. I mean, I think that we all probably have obligations and moral obligations of a certain sort to deal with spousal abuse cases, but the question isn't whether or not we simply have those obligations, but rather how we ought to discharge them, and they can be decoupled, right? And that they can be decoupling them essentially means that you can say that there are certain authorities and certain institutions that ought to be in charge or responsible for dealing with policing matters. And sometimes those fail, and sometimes it might be justified for civil society itself to act in a case where the police might not be able to effectively deal with the problem.
Right.
And I think that's true. I think that's true double in the international case, right? That's the whole point of R2P, is that it has sort of three stages of sovereignty and violations of human rights in the context of sovereignty. And intervention's only triggered in cases when states are manifestly incapable or unwilling of addressing their own problems on their own. Again, R2P is embedded within the system of sovereignty, within the system that we use to deal with international conflicts and disputes. It's not one that seeks to say, sovereign states, you're gone, we've created an international government. It's one that says within the system that we have, here are cases, in very rare exceptive cases, in which we can justify states taking action on their own. And I might add, usually they have to have some sort of authorization from either the UN Security Council or some other sort of multilateral organization.
I mean, I grant it to you. It's funny because I think, so for instance, if we go to the spousal abuse case, let me make it a little bit more interesting in the sense of, let's say this is not happening across the country, but happening somewhere in my town. I've tried, through normal things, perhaps I've tried to reason first with the husband himself, like try to gauge the situation, call him to his duties to be a decent human being. That fails. It turns out that the police don't want to get involved for whatever reason. And then I have there might be a case, yes, where the morally right thing for me to do is to kick open the door myself, right? If no one else will act. Even if that risks, my own security. I accept that. However, it becomes more interesting if, for instance, I was interested in making this woman my wife eventually. If I had other definable interests that would poison the sort of purity of my, human rights argument in intervening in this case. Other concerns that would trump that. And I think there is the way in which, and also my motive in that case, so if I was in love with this woman, another man's wife, those are the very sorts of circumstances that change the political opportunity to intervene if you transpose them on a national scale. So it's, there are resources in this country that could be better used than the current regime is using them. So we have more of an interest, more political will, which is itself a resource, in deciding whether to intervene or not. So I just don't see R2P as an escape from power politics or as a way of domesticating power politics on the global stage. I actually see it as potentially a way of discrediting human rights, because we're inevitably going to poison it with our self-interest. But I don't know.
So, first of all, I take a different view of the way that international politics works. I don't think everything is power politics. I think that ideas and norms and beliefs play a significant role in shaping the conduct of states, and that sometimes states do and truly are motivated by human rights-related concerns. I think that Libya is a great case, given that, as we know now from the reporting on the topic, the people that pushed for the Libya intervention inside the Obama administration were people like Samantha Power, who have a long public track record of being devoted to the idea of human rights itself. And since that argument carried the day, and further, it's very hard to argue that there is some sort of overriding national security concern going on in Libya. It's a pretty good test case for the idea that the pure motivation or need to act on, or at least principally, need to act in favor of universal human rights can play a causal role itself in international politics. And the second thing is that there's a distinction between motive and intent in just war theory, right? If I'm motivated to do something, it's one of the factors that play into my mind when I choose to take an action. But my intent is what goal I aim to accomplish.
Right.
And ultimately, you're supposed to, in just war theory, measure the justness of an intervention not by motive but by intent. So if my intent is really just to stop, at first anyway, just stop the killing going on in one case, it doesn't matter that there might be other motives, i.e. the fact that I might want to make my country look better in the eyes of several different other countries. That doesn't poison the intervention itself. It just simply adds on an extra motive to the intent, which remains stopping killing. As long as motives don't change one's intent fundamentally, then I don't think that they're a huge problem. Because obviously states usually or always have mixed motives, right? Because there are multiple different things going on at work, and politics is complicated.
I find it interesting that you were, devoted to human rights. I found the phrasing interesting, and here's where I'm probably going to throw this conversation into an abyss that we can't get out of. But is that I don't believe in human rights in the sense of, I just believe that they're an assertion that a cultural artifact, that has come about because of our post-Enlightenment history. I don't believe there's something that can be found in nature. And I tend not to view, when you say someone who's devoted to human rights, I tend to view, and this is getting into like a deep meta discussion that I don't think we are equipped to take on right now. Yeah. Certainly I'm not after last night. But, I tend to view ideology a lot more suspiciously than you. I tend to view it as, this is going to sound really Marxist of me, but I tend to view it as a set of creeds that justify and expand the power of a power-seeking elite. So I guess I guess for me the well is already poisoned in a sense. I don't think that there is just this pure-hearted. I guess I don't believe in the pure-heartedness of these norms as a case. That may discredit my entire argument with most of the listeners and watchers of the show. That fundamentally, I guess I wouldn't accept that this doctrine. Go ahead.
This is a very interesting sort of Marxist, pseudo-Nietzschean argument that you're making for someone who, in other contexts, I don't know whether. Actually, let me phrase this as a question. This is a better way to put it. Sure. What do you think of natural rights theology?
I think it's kind of a backwards-looking thing in the sense of. So, if you look at someone like Jacques Maritain, who a French Catholic theologian, who was very influential in establishing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think of it as a kind of backwards-looking thing, right? Or way of reasoning, in that I'm willing to accept the idea of human rights in a negative sense, in the sense of I believe in human wrongs more than human rights. I don't know if that makes sense to you intuitively.
Well, I think they're corollaries, right? I think that human rights and the way that, or at least the way that I use them, is just simply a way of signifying that there are things that ought not done to be people, and that some other things that they are owed. Right? It's just a way of expressing moral obligation. It's not a special category of things. That is, to put it in philosophy jargon, rights and obligations are correlative. Right? They're not independent objects.
I agree, but I think when we actually do rephrase things as rights, they become different than moral obligations. So, for instance, I believe, sort of theologically, I have a duty not to kill or murder. I do not believe that everyone has a right to life, such that, once you phrase it as a right to life, then that imposes obligations that I think are extraordinary, that go beyond the duty not to kill, but that So for instance, actually, that was one of my problems with the case of the woman down in Florida, which was that it seemed that there was a mistaken notion among a lot of conservatives and pro-lifers that to be pro-life meant you had to do anything to preserve human life, take any means to do so. And I don't think that's the case. I think that's an illusion created by the sense of, this language of rights.
So you think there's a strong act-omission distinction, right?
Wait, I'm sorry. Repeat that.
You think there's a strong act-omission distinction. That is, there's a difference between me choosing, a real strong moral difference between me choosing to take an action and me choosing not to take an action.
Yeah, I think there is. I think.
Why? That notion has always mystified me. It just seems like inaction is a particular form of action. It's just you choose to do nothing. In both cases, it's an act of will. You're making a conscious, clear decision to act or not to act, right? To kill someone or to just let them die, right?
It's different though. So, for instance, if I believe, no one takes say a person's right to live so seriously that, if say I was, I don't know, wealthy or powerful in my town, and then everyone else neglected to do things like, feed themselves or take care of basic hygiene, that then it was my duty as a wealthy and powerful person to hire servants to do these things for them. And I think that's the kind of obligation that rights language begins to impose on human behavior. That it's all searching. So, for instance, in the abortion debate, where I'm very comfortable making these distinctions, I believe that it's wrong for parents to deliberately take the life of their unborn child. I don't believe, if I believed, I suppose, in a right to life, as it's commonly phrased, it means that it would justify any intervention in the life of the mother to preserve the life of a child. I don't believe in that, right? So I don't believe that you have to, use any surgery or any technique to preserve the life of an unborn child that might also endanger the life of the mother as well.
Well, yeah, but that follows directly from the idea that you should treat all lives as being morally equal. Now, I obviously don't accept your premise, being a pro-choice person and all that,
right.
That the child is a life in most of these circumstances, not in any
right.
meaningful sense. But the point is, you still, when you accept that you have a positive obligation to act, you're just endorsing that all lives should be treated equally. That is, not just the ones that you choose to act about, but rather all other persons that exist in the world are still people. And this is sort of essentially, I think, a consequence of our well-established moral belief that most distinctions between human beings are arbitrary. That is, we've stopped discriminating against people on the basis of their race or their gender. Right? Those are uncontroversial now in the United States and increasingly more countries around the world. It's because we think those categories are arbitrary, and that ultimately what matters is that people are people. And if that's true, and what matters about a person is that they're in fact a person who has needs, and your decision not to help them strikes me as every bit, and I realize I'm running together two issues there, but your decision not to help them is to make a conscious choice about the fate of that person. A person who I think deserves as equal concern as you or I or anyone else does.
Right. See, what you're lighting there is a lot, though. So, for instance, not every person to me is a person. There's a person that's going to come home later that's my wife, and I have very different responsibilities toward her socially than I do towards a Chinese dictator or a Chinese peasant. And they are very different people. Ontologically, toward God, they may be equal souls, but my obligations and duties are socially defined. And I don't accept that there are very intelligible obligations I have that are universal, in the sense that I have to um, that I have to provide universally. Like, now there may be things where universally, I believe, if I come in contact with people, I owe them my respect, my regard, etc. But I don't think I'm under obligation if I hear about suffering somewhere else, that's very distant from me. I don't think I have an obligation to do whatever is possible to stop it. That's where I think we're disagreeing.
Yeah, I think that you said it yourself, right? That our obligations towards the people that are closest to us are socially defined. They're defined because we've set up society and human situations in a particular fashion. That is, we, for the most part, couple up and take care of each other, and those couple, that family foundation ends up taking care of their children, and various different other similar relations emerge inside society where people have direct relations to other persons, and they're, to a degree, socially tasked with taking the lead on that one person, on guaranteeing that one person their rights and individual liberty and protections and so on, right? And that's true conventionally, but I don't think that makes a difference abstractly morally. Like, we do that because it's the way that we are. But the fact that it's the way that we are doesn't lessen our obligations towards other people or make us, in a way, less morally culpable for the fact that we aren't doing as much as we can for humanity writ large. It just means that we exist inside a system and we have a certain psychological makeup that limits our capability to act perfectly morally. That is, there are some moral obligations that people are never going to achieve, never going to accomplish properly. And I recognize I'm as guilty of those as anyone else. The point is to try harder, and I guess my point here is that we can be doing better than we are on this scale. And that accepting my argument doesn't mean demolishing society. It means slowly, conservatively, I might say, readjusting the scope of our moral concern and taking more actions than we do right now to help those that are distant from us.
Well, I mean, I have to think about it. When you say something like, we can be doing better, in all contexts, I believe that. But I am afraid of what your abstraction will imply. If we took it to specifics, I really wonder what it would mean.
Well, I mean, for starters, we should all be, especially those of us in first world countries, should be giving more money to charity than we do. We can start with that. Right, and there's a number of different foundations that have been set up to deal with that problem. But that's pretty basic.
I agree with that. I agree with that. But it would be different. That's also a good act, right? I tend to think of giving of your excess is something good and almost supererogatory virtue. Mm-hmm. Rather than something that if you're failing, that it's some kind of serious sin. I'd have to think about the circumstances specifically, but what I'm afraid of is, so I may have a duty to those around me, but what I'm afraid of with rights language is it says something like that somehow I have to make it so that I can provide equally for something very far away. That if we haven't guaranteed a good and decent life for every single living being, that somehow we're guilty or seriously failing. When I think often the solution is something locally, right? So I guess what I'm driving at is that a dictator that is oppressing his people is guilty of oppression. Me sitting in a wealthy suburb of New York City and not dedicating large amounts of my moral, financial, and intellectual wherewithal to defeating that dictator, I am not guilty of oppression of those people that he's ruling.
But I'm not sure that alters your moral obligations in those cases. It is true that you are not, as a descriptive fact, oppressing those persons. That's the government, the local dictators doing that. But if there's anything that you could be doing to make their lives better or their suffering less bad, or I for that matter, right, or all persons, right, anything that we could do to make that slightly better and that we're not doing, it's on our heads because there's a causal relationship between our lack of action and their suffering. And that's no different.
See, I don't necessarily agree with that.
Well, it's stipulated. It's tautological from the setup, right? If there's something that we can be doing that could be helping them, then it follows that our lack of action is directly, causally, descriptively lowering someone's...
What level of obligation, right? So I could decide, right, and people have done this, like adventurous, like aristocrats used to do these sorts of things, that a certain tyranny grieved me, even from afar, that I will not take a wife, I will join a mercenary group, I will infiltrate the country, go in, take up arms, and try to destroy this dictatorship. That's something I could theoretically do. Or I could go to the supermarket, buy some organic chicken, and make dinner for my family tonight. Like, there's an infinite number of things I could be doing to make the world better. And I would argue that sometimes doing those things would be in direct conflict with more local duties. Maybe someone should be assigned by society to go in and join mercenary groups to end dictatorships. But I don't think that if I choose tonight to go to the supermarket, come home, make dinner, watch a baseball game, that makes me guilty in any measure of the suffering of the people of North Korea. Like, it just doesn't follow.
I'm not quite sure why, though. It seems to me that there's no meaningful... If there isn't any in-principle distinction one can draw between act and inaction, then it seems like it's hard to say why we're not responsible for suffering that we're not preventing. Right? It seems like as a matter of gut feeling that that's true. But often we believe lots of things as a matter of gut feeling that turn out to be wrong. So that's not a good reason to believe in something, sheer intuition. It's sort of why. But you also raised a question about role responsibilities, and I think because I have to leave, I think I'll end on a note that I think we'll agree about, is I think that's one of the beauties of a sort of liberal capital system, and liberal democracy in the sense of women's rights, not left liberal, is that it allows people to pursue their private passions, but does it in such a fashion that it harnesses that action for the public good. And so it uses the basic makeup of human psychology to accomplish collective ends. And that's why I don't think everything needs to be directly planned. I don't think the government needs to be making all of these moral determinations for us. I don't think that's always going to be effective or most to the benefit of everyone. I think there's supreme value in freedom to do what you want in a lot of different circumstances. I think that we have figured out a system that helps us accomplish that. The question is how best to perfect it, I think.
The question is what? I need to repeat that again. I'm sorry.
Oh, the question is how to best perfect it now, I think, in any event. How to improve the liberal capital system that we have, not whether or not we need to, on the basis of abstract moral argument, radically reorganize society.
Right. I mean, stated that way, it's hard for me to disagree.
Right. That was actually the point.
Well, then we've ended on a bit of comedy, which I think was our overriding moral duty towards the talking heads and this audience. So we may be guilty of genocide in North Korea, but we at least got this right.
Well done. Well done, us.
All right. Well,
okay.
Take care, Zach, and
Take care,
we will
Michael.
do this again.
Absolutely. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.